Good evening, and welcome to the Southgate Street Museum in Newport. I'm Mark Nykirk, the director of the Scripps Howard Center for Civic Engagement at Northern Kentucky University, and this is our fourth lecture in the 6 at 6 series this year. The 6 at 6 series, which is in its 12th year, brings the research and creative activity of NKU faculty and students to the community. We also have some guest lecturers this year. We will be going through the early summer on the third Tuesday of each night. So join us for all the lectures as we proceed through 2021. We are at the Southgate Street School in Newport, a museum that is located in an old school where the African-American citizens of Campbell County were educated for 80 years. And I'll introduce Scott Clark in just a moment to tell you a little more about that. But there's a reason that we're here, and that is that the series this year is focused on Black history and culture. It seemed like an important time to do that, and we have had some spectacular lectures so far, I think, and you'll find the same is true as the season goes on. So thank you for being with us. I want to tell you that one day we'll all be back together and do this in person. We have community partners where we can do these talks, and those include the Behringer Crawford Museum, the Mercantile Library, the Carnegie Center, the Baker Hunt Arts and Cultural Center, also in Covington, and the Campbell County Library. We have another co-host tonight, the Holocaust Center at Museum Center, so we welcome their support and their unity with us in bringing this topic to the community. So. Tonight, Dr. David Childs will speak, and then we'll have time for Q&A afterward. You will see in the bottom of your screen a place where you can put your questions. Just type those and we'll be ready for them. And before we move into the lecture, I would just like to invite Scott Clark to tell you a little bit about this special place. Scott.
Thank you, Mark. Once again, we're very excited to be the broadcast place for the 6 at 6 lectures, and we're very grateful to the Scripps Howard Center for Civic Engagement for their continued collaboration here at our museum. This building is a testament to the people that came before us, and actually those that will come after us, because of what was going on here in Newport and in Campbell County. Shortly after the Civil War, when Kentucky was still considered a slave state, the city of Newport, along with some prominent African Americans in town, established this school, the Southgate Street School, a segregated school to educate Black children. This site has been the site of that school since 1870. This present building that we're in was built in 1893. It's a really interesting, significant structure that I welcome you when we're all back together again to come out and see. But the excitement of what happens here is the fact that if there was such a thing as a separate but equal, I would say that the kids in this school actually received an even better education than perhaps their white counterparts were in their segregated school. That the kids that were here for 80 years were taught that they could be who they wanted to be, that they could excel in life, that they could advance their education, they could no longer be the children of domestics or the children of people working in the steel mills or the people working in cafes or restaurants, that they could be whoever they wanted to be. And so many of those students that passed through this, the hundreds of students that passed through this school are testament to that. We welcome you to come and join us and visit our museum. For now, maybe just a little bit on Facebook, but as we open back up, hopefully next summer, to see the magic that happened here. We have wonderful first-person oral histories that talk about how the students were treated. We have some artifacts that are based at the school, and it is a great opportunity to see the value of education and how education empowers. There is also recently a mural that was put up on Newport's flood wall on Route 8 that actually shows the empowerment of education as a student progresses through the Southgate Street School and on to higher education and onto their lives. So we are grateful that you are all here with us. Thank you. We're looking forward to a wonderful talk by Dr. Childs, and I'm sure that we'll all come away much more enlightened from this. And so I'm going to turn it back to Mark, and thank you all for being here, and we look forward to seeing you again.
Thank you, Scott. And one other thank you I want to say real quick for Norse Media. These are the students who are doing our production tonight, and they're here with us, socially distanced and masked, and making all this work. Norse Media is a co-curricular activity at NKU. So these are students who are looking to do this in their career, and they're learning in the classroom, but also in the real world. And that also is part of why we have this ongoing partnership with the museum. There have been about 15 classes that have worked here, helping set up the exhibits, research the exhibits, helping with some financial models and some community engagement models. So it's an extension of the NKU campus, if you will, and we appreciate Newport's support in allowing us to be here for that. I am pleased to welcome Dr. David Childs as our speaker this evening. Dr. Childs teaches in the College of Education, social studies education, and so he's uniquely qualified to educate us tonight. Dr. Childs will also be back here at this museum on January the 18th. So if there are any teachers in the audience, I mark that date on your calendar. It's Martin Luther King Day. And on that day, the Thomas D. Clark Foundation, which supports the University Press of Kentucky, will be hosting a Teach the Teachers workshop. And we'd love for you to register for that. David will be one of our presenters, and he will be presenting from here. One of the two venues for that day are the Southgate Street School and the Ali Center in Louisville. So teachers, we'd love for you to sign up. You can find information about it on the Facebook page for the Scripps Howard Center for Civic Engagement. So David, in addition to his classroom duties, coordinates Democracy in Me, a project in collaboration with WVXU FM, our local public radio station. It includes a blog and resources for teachers and for studying democracy, always a good thing for we citizens to do. So Dr. Childs, thank you for being with us, and folks, enjoy the lecture and remember the Q&A function.
Thank you so much, Mark. You noticed that we'll just jump right into it. As he said, I'm Dr. Childs at NKU, teach social studies and history. You notice that first slide, there are two pictures of a funeral. On the left, you see the black and white one, and that is from 1946. It's a lynching that took place, actually a group lynching that took place, and that's the funeral in Georgia of a black family. And you can see the devastation of that impact, the impact of a lynching on an African-American family. And then to the right, you can see a more recent funeral of George Floyd from 2020. And so that kind of sets the context of what we're going to talk about today: modern day lynching, putting sanctioned violence against African-Americans within a historical context, 1619 to 2020. That 1619 date, of course, is when slavery first came to colonial America, North America. Of course, it was in Florida, in Spanish Florida before that, but we like to use the date of 1619. Next slide, please. What I want to do is open up with a story, a tale of two black men. I'm going to call it a tale of two black men. Driving while black, a tale of two black men. As I entered into the used car dealership, I was already experiencing fatigue, having gone into several other establishments in search of the perfect car for the perfect price. There was one more dealership I wanted to try before I called it a day. I had just gotten off work and had on business attire when I walked in and saw a friendly face, but was even more pleased when the salesman that was helping me was an African American like myself, probably about 10 years my senior. He seemed like a great guy. He seemed genuine. Furthermore, he was quite accomplished, had a great family, and was even an ordained minister. He liked sales because he was a people person and liked the daily interactions. We instantly hit it off. He even knew some of the same people that I knew, so this put me at ease even more so. It was not long before I selected a car that I liked, and he urged me to test drive it. It was a relatively new car, only a few years old. He suggested that we drive to another of their lots in a nearby city, about 15 minutes away, to check out their other inventory of cars. I thought this was a great idea. About a third of the way into the trip, while in a residential area, a police officer pulled in behind us and began to follow us. It was not long before he turned on his flashing lights. My new friend and I exchanged glances as we saw the flashing lights behind us. The nonverbals between us went something like, "Here we go again. And I cannot believe this is happening again." I looked down at my speedometer. I was not speeding. I thought back to the less than 15 minutes of driving I had done. I had not run any red lights or stop signs. I had used all of my proper signaling. After we pulled over, the officer walked up to the car and was very candid. "Sir, the reason I'm pulling you over is that this is an area where frequent drug dealers take place, and you guys, quote, fit the description." So you had two African-American men in a vehicle dressed in business attire, and still we fit the description in their mind of a drug dealer or drug dealers. So think about this. Both dressed in ties and suits, much like you see me today. And if you haven't guessed, the stories about me, a professor and my constituent, my colleague there was a clergyman, and still all the officer saw was two drug dealers. Well, my new friend and I relaxed ourselves because this was not our first rodeo. And I spoke to the officer kindly. After he took our licenses and ran our names through the system, he let us go. And I thought to myself, what might have happened if we had responded differently, if we had responded in anger like we were, but we knew sort of how to handle the situation. Next slide, please. I would like to continue by saying that this talk is not an outright indictment against the police as a whole, nor is it a talk on defunding the police. In fact, I've had this conversation with several of my friends who are police officers, both black and white, but the talk will situate the contemporary violence, the sanctioned violence endorsed by society and government officials. We'll talk about that and put it in a historical context. That is killing of African Americans that society seems to be okay with without due process. Let's look at history. The police killings of African Americans and even radical groups like the Proud Boys, who have been encouraged by the federal government, and those individuals have defaced and destroyed Black-owned properties in institutions such as churches, individuals like Dylan Roof, and also the young man in Wisconsin. Society seems to encourage the destruction of Black bodies without due process. So I thought we would put it in a historical context. I put on the lens of, I come from a lens of, as a historian, a lot of times in the United States, we look at things ahistorically. We look at things myopically as if it just happened and we're not used to looking at things within a historical context. So I thought I would put some things in history today. Contemporary violence at a racial nature did not happen in a historical vacuum. With this in mind, I would like to go back to antebellum times, pre-Civil War, during the time of slavery, and look at violence against enslaved Blacks as a starting point. Next slide, please. 1619 to 1865, I talked about that date, 1619. I always like to remind people that in 1619, you didn't have slavery as it would become to be known by the end of the 1600s into the 1700s. It was more racialized slavery, and then you had chattel slavery. But the first African Americans that came to Virginia, Jamestown, were indentured servants. And so in some ways, they were on the same status as their white counterparts. They were indentured servants. But even before that, if you talk about North America, there were slaves even in the 1500s that went to Spanish Florida. A good lesson for people, if you want to get an understanding of history, also study historical geography. That is what places used to be, what states used to be. Like Florida was not always the United States, for example. And it was Spanish Florida, and one time it was French Florida, and then Louisiana, for example, was French Louisiana. But slaves could escape south. So if you were in Georgia, before Florida was a part of the United States, you can escape south to Spain. But you had slaves earlier than 1619, but we're going to use the date 1619 today. The legacy of slavery in the U.S. justified the use of violence, rape, and murder in the minds of antebellum white society. That mindset continued well beyond slavery. Since slavery became widespread in the late 1600s, violence was used to quell the freedom and movement of African Americans. Indeed, slave masters, slave ship captains, slave catchers, and slave patrollers used unrestricted and unrestrained violence as a matter of course to control and instill fear in the Black community. And that's why we use the word sanctioned and justified violence against Black bodies. Slaves had hands cut off, and often my dissertation work was on the history of African American education as it relates to the role that Black church played. And one of the things I looked at was penalties for individuals that were caught reading or caught teaching. Often, if you were caught with a book in some states in the South, you could have your finger cut off, or you can even have a hand cut off if you were caught teaching other Blacks. And so this is that violence. And I want you to think about that, this history of violence against Black and brown folks, particularly African-American enslaved people. Slaves had hands cut off, various other body parts mutilated to keep them from escaping. Whippings were the method of punishment often used to maintain order on plantations. Slaves often were killed with no due process or punishment implemented by law against slave masters because they were property. That's what chattel slavery is all about. So property cannot sue. Property cannot pursue due process. And so if it's capitalism. So if I own something, it's mine. It's free market society. So if I own something, or in that case, a slave, which was a person, I can do what I want with it, and I have no legal standing. That's what critical race theory gets into, whiteness as property, in terms of the legal system holding up white supremacy. That's what critical race scholars get into. But in this same way, if as a slave owner, I could do anything I want to my property. And so that's going to encourage unspeakable violence. Next slide, please. Frederick Douglass talks about this in his autobiography. I'm going to just be mentioning some books that you want to grab. Some of you may have heard of this, some of the books, but in Frederick Douglass' slave narrative, he talks about his whole experience as a slave. And one of the things on page 16 in my copy, he talks about his experience with violence as a slave. He says, I remember the first time I ever witnessed this horrible exhibition. I was quite a child, but I well remember it. I shall never forget it whilst I remember anything. It was the first of a long series of such outrages of which I was doomed to be a witness and a participant. It struck me with awful force. It was the blood-stained gate. the entrance to the hell of slavery through which I was about to pass. It was a most terrible spectacle. I wish I could commit to paper the feelings with which I beheld it. What is Douglass talking about? In Douglass's autobiography, it is both a personal coming of age tale as well as an indictment of the horrors of slavery. This passage exhibits both things. On the one hand, this is a very personal recollection of a young boy's experience. He sees his aunt. The description of him is when he saw his aunt being beaten mercilessly and wonders if he will be next. That speaks of the violence, the unthinkable, unspeakable, unimaginable violence that for centuries African Americans underwent. As an adult, he writes that he realizes that this was one of the first times he really became aware that he was enslaved and what the horrors of that position entailed. He saw the justice and the cruelty and was forever scarred. His worldview grew at that moment as he became aware of what outrages could be perpetrated against an innocent slave. What I want you to continue to think about is the history of violence against African Americans, because pretty soon we're going to make a leap forward into contemporary times in terms of connecting this to modern violence. Next slide, please. One major form of violence was through slave patrollers. Voluntary slave patrollers acted as a sort of early police specifically to monitor African Americans. Their sole responsibility was to, quote unquote, police blacks, both free and enslaved. Their expressed aim was to restrict the movement of black folk. Here's an oath, a slave patroller's oath from North Carolina, 1828 states, I, patroller's name, do swear that I will, as searcher for guns, swords, and other weapons among the slaves in my district, faithfully and as privately as I can discharge the trust reposed in me as the law directs to the best of my power, so help me God. That was an oath that a slave patroller took in North Carolina to monitor slaves. They took an oath. Charles Hanson, writing for the National Law Enforcement Museum, states this about, he gives us insight about early slave patrollers. When one thinks about policing in early America, there are a few images that may come to mind. And so what he's doing is making connections between those early slave patrollers and modern policing. A county sheriff enforcing a debt between neighbors, a constable serving an arrest warrant on horseback is what we often think about with early policing, or a lone night watchman carrying a lantern through his sleeping town. These organized practices were adapted to the colonies from England and formed the foundation of American law enforcement indeed. However, there's another significant origin of American policing that we cannot forget, and that is slave patrols. The American South relied almost exclusively on slave labor, and white Southerners lived in near constant fear of slave rebellions disrupting this economic status quo. As a result, these patrols were one of the earliest and most prolific forms of early policing in the South. The responsibility of patrols was straightforward: to control the movements and behaviors of enslaved populations. According to historian Gary Potter, slave patrols served three functions. One, to chase down, apprehend, return to their owners runaway slaves. Two, to provide a form of organized terror to deter slave revolts. Three, to maintain a form of discipline for slave workers who were subject to summary justice outside of the law. Organized policing was one of the many types of social control imposed on enslaved African Americans in the South. Let me say that again. Organized policing was one of the many types of social controls imposed on enslaved African Americans in the South. Physical and psychological violence took many forms, including an overseer's brutal whip, the intentional breakup of families, the intentional rape of the wives of enslaved men, the rape of underage girls. Violence took on many forms: deprivation of food and other necessities, and the private employment of slave catchers to track down the runaways. Slave patrols were no less violent in their control of African Americans. They beat and terrorized as well. Their distinction was that they were legally compelled to do so by local authorities. In this sense, it was considered a civic duty, one that in some areas could result in a fine if avoided. In others, patrollers received financial compensation for their work. Typically, slave patrol routines included enforcing curfews, checking travelers for a permission pass, catching those assembling without permission, and preventing any form of organized resistance. As historian Sally Haddon writes in her book, her book entitled Slave Patrols, Law and Violence in Virginia and the Carolinas, she writes, the history of police work in the South grows out of this early fascination by white patrollers with what African American slaves were doing. Most law enforcement was by definition white patrolmen watching, catching, or beating Black slaves in the South, and even free Blacks as well. The process of how one became a patroller differed through the colonies. Some governments ordered local militia to select patrollers from their rosters of white men in the region with a certain age range. In many areas, patrollers were made up of lower class and wealthy land-owning men, white men alike. Other areas pulled names from lists of local landowners. Interestingly enough, in the 18th century, South Carolina, land-owning white women were included in the potential list of names. If they were called to duty, they were given the option to identify a male substitute to patrol in their place. After the Civil War, Southern police departments often carried over aspects of the patrols. These included systemic surveillance, the enforcement of curfews, even notions of who could become a police officer. Though a small number of African Americans joined the police force in the South during Reconstruction, they met active resistance. I want to also add, Haddon argues that there are distinct parallels between the legal slave patrols before the war and extra-legal terrorization tactics used by vigilante groups during Reconstruction, most notoriously the Ku Klux Klan. Though law enforcement looks very different today, the profession developed from practices implemented in the colonies. Next slide, please. Let me say something about this. Slave patrollers were at liberty to use deadly force if necessary, including guns, other physical weapons in order to apprehend a Black person. Next slide, please. The history of policing, of course, began long before colonial America. To be clear, the notion of policing was developed well before the forming of the United States of America, even before colonial America. For example, one historian points out that Augustus Caesar, born in 27 BC, created the cohortes urbanae near the end of his reign to police ancient Rome. Policing in England takes rudimentary form with Henry II's proclamation of the Assize of Arms in 1181. In the 1600s, England established constables and justices of the peace to oversee them. The Metropolitan Police Act created the first recognizable police force in the UK in 1829. Meanwhile, in America, the first constables were created in the 1630s in what came to be known as New England. Boston has the oldest, quote unquote, modern police department. It was created in 1838. New York and Philadelphia soon followed. But what I'm saying is that viewing African Americans as a group that needs to be more policed and regulated than others, and that an impulsive and rapid use of violence is nothing new and should be placed within historical context. So I'm not arguing that policing started with slave patrols, arguing that this early mindset that Black bodies need to be monitored and they're somehow more deviant and criminal and thuggish, if you will, than their white counterparts is still, that mindset is still going on today. Even myself, my son and I, for example, were, just to talk about a modern example, we were coming home and I identify as a Christian. We were coming home from church and a police officer was telling us, my son is a teenager and he looks like an adult, and the police officer followed us and right up into our driveway, and he blocked our driveway as if we were some criminals. And I just sat there and waited. He comes up to the car and made up really kind of a bogus reason to be pulling us over because he did not give us a ticket. And he asked me for my ID and I showed him. And then he asked my son for his ID. And at that time he was 14, he did not have an ID. And I said, please don't ask my son for an ID. He's a minor. And it was just clear that his perception of us was different from our reality. And he saw my son, and it scared me because he saw my son as an adult male. So that's an example of, that's why I put things in historical context. This fear in Southern white society, but also Northern, not just, and a lot of people think about slavery in the South. I need to say this, but slavery was in New England as well, all the way up to the early 1800s. So you had this behavior all over the United States, not just in the South. You had these patrols, their sole responsibility was to monitor the movement of Black folks out of fear. You see the same mindset today. Next slide, please. These are what you see here, some slave patrollers restricted the movement of Black folks. These were badges from 1859, runaway slave patrol badges from North and South Carolina. And one of these is a plantation police badge from Georgetown County, South Carolina. It's for the runaway slave patrol. These badges were used during slavery times to find and bring back slaves that escaped from plantations. This is a real piece of history, and you notice it looks like a police badge today. Next slide, please. And this is another example. The slave patrolling system in the South set the historical precedent of how many police officers treat African Americans in contemporary times. So it set the precedent for that. Next slide, please. Neighborhood watch patrolling Blacks. In the same way, this set the precedent for the attitudes of many whites towards Black folks today as criminals and more deviant than most. Furthermore, they need to be monitored. And I always like to cite this statistic. There are more white drug dealers than Black drug dealers in this country, statistically. But the Black and brown folks, the Hispanics, African Americans, usually get the bad rap for being the most notorious drug dealers because of the media primarily. We see a lot of movies, we see a lot of the news that portray people of color as criminals. But in terms of the neighborhood watch, furthermore, they need to be monitored. I think African Americans need to be monitored, reported on, apprehended if quote unquote citizens feel Blacks are getting out of line in the name of keeping the community safe and quote unquote stable. So if they see that Blacks are getting out of line by arbitrary rules, it could be you're walking down the street in modern terms with a hoodie on. It could be 2 or 3 African-American young men going home from a basketball game, but it looks suspicious. Anything that the neighborhood watch community deems, the officers deem as suspicious, they have a right to apprehend them in some neighborhoods. This was the same mindset as slave patrollers. Next slide, please. Just another sign that this is a neighborhood watch community, keep going. Often in neighborhood watches, the perpetrators in people's minds are Black. In many ways, in many rural communities in both the North and South, and in predominantly white neighborhoods throughout the US, neighborhood watch committees have been developed with the same spirit of quote unquote keeping the neighborhood safe from thugs and criminals who they usually envision as people of color. Did you hear that? They usually envision thugs and criminals as people of color, but statistically that's not always the case. There's a show that I like to watch called I Almost Got Away with It. And some of the biggest, most notorious drug dealers are middle-class white males. Bank robbers, you should watch it, and it defies the stereotype on who society thinks is a criminal. These same individuals, the neighborhood watch folks, will claim that they do not see color, but when they see a black person walking down the street, jogging, driving in the neighborhood, getting their mail in an apartment building, on campus, or any space they deem a quote-unquote white space, they feel the need to patrol them or report quote-unquote suspicious behavior. Next slide, please. So perhaps one of the most terrorizing forms of punishment for blacks, both slave and free during the antebellum times, was hanging, commonly called lynching. Between 1877 and 1950, there were 4,084 African Americans hanged between 1877 and 1950. But historians have come to see the term lynching as being a term that encompasses more than just hanging. This is an important point I want to make. When I talk about lynching in this lecture, I'm not just talking about hanging. We're going to primarily be thinking about hanging, but when we say lynching, in a historical sense, is any form of capital punishment against blacks without due process, including shooting, burning, torturing, hanging, brutalization, drowning. That's all lynching, according to my understanding of lynching. And so we're going to take that, once we get into the modern context, that'll help us frame what we're calling lynching as it relates to the police shootings. Next slide, please. The next few slides will show a history of violence against African Americans after slavery, primarily in the form of hanging, but also thinking of lynching within the broader understanding that we mentioned. We should also think about the notion of domestic terrorism here in the United States. Often when we think about terrorism, we think of folks from the Middle East, Saudi Arabia, Pakistan, and Islamic countries. And actually, for African Americans, the biggest terrorist threat historically for folks like myself has been white supremacist group in the KKK. They have wrought the most terrorism on the black community historically than Islamic Islamofascists have ever done. Islamic fundamentalists have ever done. And so when I think about myself, and many historians think about terrorism, we think about a lot of the white supremacist groups that have terrorized black communities for years and years and years, even to this present day. Next slide, please. And you see more of the violence there, an actual burning. And look at the crowd. Notice the crowd, how pleased they are. It's sort of like, okay, we kept him in his place. Often they would do this to a black business owner that was getting above his raising, or a minister that began to talk about civil rights, or a labor organizer that was trying to organize poor folk, or sometimes they were trying to get out and get the vote and cause African Americans to be more enfranchised. They would use violence to suppress them. In fact, the definition of terrorism is using violence for political means. So yes, next slide, please. And this is from 1920. This is Lige Daniels in Center, Texas. This is a postcard depicting the lynching of Lige Daniels in Texas, August 3rd, 1920. The back reads, "This was made in the courtyard in Center, Texas." So this always takes me aback when I see this kind of thing, postcards that normalize the violence. Next slide, please. This is from 1946. This is at Moore's Ford, Georgia. Remember the funeral that we looked at the first slide? That funeral was from this hanging. Much violence against, there were also, mostly you saw black men hung and lynched, but also you saw women. Much violence against black women as well, but a clear pattern of violence against black males has been the norm since colonial times in the US. Next slide, please. And this is from the 16th Street Baptist Church. So remember, our broad definition of lynching is sanctioned violence against the black community. And so this is from the 16th Street Baptist Church. I had a chance to go out there to that site in Birmingham. It's sad, 4 little girls were in Sunday school, and the KKK bombed the church, and 4 little girls were killed. One of the saddest days really in U.S. history. Next slide, please. This is an image of the Ku Klux Klan. They took a lot of pictures to intimidate people, to sort of reinforce the status quo. Violence against Black males from the Ku Klux Klan has been a staple throughout the U.S. history. The KKK has long been a symbol of terror and terrorism in the African-American community as well. Next slide. By the way, back up. Go back again. I'm sorry. That's a deceased man in the middle of them. They are holding up a body in the middle of them. And that sends chills in the spine of the Black community. Next slide, please. And this struck me too. I just found some of these pictures so appalling. I titled this "White Supremacy Masquerading as Christianity." Often, the KKK would approach ministers and offer them membership and high-profile positions in the KKK if they endorsed them, if the ministers became part of the KKK. So get this, you had ministers a part of the Ku Klux Klan in the South because it was thought of as a prestigious organization in the South. Next slide, please. This same image, although the picture below is from the 1920s, the spirit of this hate is among us today via politics and the alt-right, law enforcement that are members of the Klan. There's still a lot of things coming out about law enforcement, officers that are part of white supremacist groups, pastors that are advocating civil war if the election does not go their way. So this spirit is still among us today. Next slide. So even in our time, some people have the same attitude towards African Americans today, no matter who they are or what their status is. So you see the photo on my left is from 1939, a picture of a Klansman with a noose from Miami, Florida. And then on the right is right in Boone County, Indiana, 2012, an effigy of Barack Obama hanging with the Halloween mask of depicting Barack Obama hanging prominent. And that's on a prominent highway too, so everybody saw that. That same mindset is here today. Next slide, please. And so now we're going to take it to just more modern times. Now that we have laid a historical foundation, the next few slides will connect modern government sanctioned police and community violence against African Americans within that historical context. That is to remind us that we need the police and law enforcement, but attitudes towards African Americans play out in how African Americans are treated and how people respond to Black folks. And so just a little bit more historical context. 1969, Black Panther leaders Fred Hampton and Mark Clark were slain in a police raid. 1972 to 1991, the Johannesburg police torture scandal, sanctioned violence. Keep going, please. Next slide. 1980, a crew of white detectives responded to the killing of a white police officer in 1980 by terrorizing the Black community of Algiers, killing 4 innocent people and torturing numerous others. So you see what we did? We did a survey of African American history and just looked at this trend of violence. In other words, the recent violence that we see today is not an anomaly. That's what we're getting at. 2005, an officer fatally shot an unarmed Black man named Henry Glover. Then several of his fellow officers burned his body to cover up their crime. Next slide, please. That's in New Orleans. In New York, 1997, an NYPD officer sexually assaulted a Haitian American man named Abner Louima in a precinct station bathroom by shoving a broken broomstick up his rectum. 1999, same city, New York, 4 officers from NYPD Street Crimes Unit fired 41 shots at Ahmaud Diallo, a Guinea immigrant who was reaching for his wallet, hitting him 19 times. Next slide, please. 1991, this is Los Angeles. Among the most notorious cases was the brutal 1991 beating of Rodney King by 5 LAPD officers. A videotape captured most of the brutality and also showed several other officers standing by and doing nothing to stop the pummeling of a defenseless Black man. 2014, well, not this past August, the August of 2014, LAPD officers fatally shot an unarmed, mentally ill African-American man named Ezzo Ford, who witnesses said was shot in the back while lying on the ground. Keep going. 2007 and 2012, in Milwaukee, a unit of white police officers spurred on by the department's CompStat program of aggressive policing stopped and illegally body cavity searched more than 70 African Americans, men, whom they claimed to be investigating for drug dealing. Keep going, please. And Trayvon Martin, 2012. It seems like it's surprised. It went by so fast. I can't believe it was that long ago. Trayvon Martin, his dates were 1995 to 2012, was a 17-year-old African-American from Miami Gardens, Florida, who was fatally shot by George Zimmerman, a neighborhood watch volunteer. Remember what we talked about, neighborhood watches in Sanford, Florida. Martin had gone with his father on a visit to the father's fiance at her townhome. He had a pack of Skittles, so I'll keep going. July 2014, New York City, Eric Garner killing in New York. Footage filmed by a bystander shows Eric Garner being wrestled to the ground in a chokehold, illegal chokehold, by an NYPD officer before turning limp. The 43-year-old father can be heard gasping for air, saying, "I can't breathe." He was later pronounced dead at the hospital. Next slide, please. August 2014, Mike Brown killing, Ferguson, Missouri. The legacy of racism in Ferguson is related to that. There's a whole trajectory and history of violence in Ferguson community against African Americans. Next slide, please. Thank you. 2015, the church massacre, Emmanuel AME Church, Charleston, South Carolina. Several people, the pastor, the manager, a librarian, a church choir member, a 70-year-old building manager, the church sexton was killed, a pastor, administrator, admissions coordinator, a university official, basically. Prominent folks, pillars in the community were killed during Bible study, all the way down to a pastor, also a speech therapist and a track coach. 2015. Next slide, please. Thank you. September 2018, Botham Jean, a devout Christian, 26-year-old, Little Rock, Arkansas, shot and killed by Amber Geiger, who was a Dallas police officer who had gone into his apartment without probable cause, unannounced, September 6, 2018. He's a martyr today. Next slide, please. Thank you. Tamir Rice, 12-year-old. This brings me pause for concern because my son, the story I gave you where my son was thought to be an adult male, this perception that black males are threatening. He was killed. Then you have Jordan Edwards, 15 years old. Next slide, please. Ahmaud Arbery, May 20th. We're coming to our contemporary times. 2020, this year, murdered while he was out jogging by two white men with supremacist ties. They were neighborhood watch men. Okay, that's why I made that historical connection. Next slide, please. May 25th, 2020, George Floyd, a white Minneapolis police officer, kneeled on Floyd's neck for at least 7 minutes. And he was saying, "I can't breathe." We saw that again. Okay, so I think it's clear what I'm doing historically. Next slide, please. Breonna Taylor, May 25th, 2020, 26-year-old African-American woman was fatally shot in her Louisville, Kentucky apartment, doing nothing, no threat at all. March 13th, 2020. Actually, it's May, I'm sorry. Go ahead, next slide. Many more have been killed by the hands of innocent law enforcement. Next slide. I like to show this slide. Police say the 6th leading cause of death for young black men is by police shooting. A July 2020 article from Northeastern News argues that yes, more white people are killed by the police than blacks, but that misses the point. the Northeastern professor Matthew Miller, Dr. Matthew Miller, says that Black people are killed by police at a higher rate than white people. A recent study by Miller found that Black people are shot and killed by police at twice the rate that white people are. Matthew Miller is a professor of health sciences. He says, why are Black people still dying at the hands of law enforcement? Overall, close to 1,000 people are shot to death by police officers in the US every year, according to a database maintained by the Washington Post. It is true that a majority of those victims are white people. That's only because there are so many more white people than there are Black people in our country, says Miller. Miller participated in a Northeastern Harvard data-driven study that combed through shooting deaths by police across 27 states back in 2014, 2015. Based on details called from police and medical examiner reports by the National Violent Death Reporter System, this study found that Black people were killed at a rate higher than their proportion to the national population. Quote, although Black people represented 12% of the population in the states we studied, they made up 25% of the deaths in police shootings. So I wanted to just offer that information. Next slide, please. And so as I begin to close, I'm going to give you some resources here momentarily. My point is not to say that the police is bad and that we don't need police or defund the police. I wanted to just put all of this in historical context and say the issues that we have today are not new. The mindsets that we have today are not new. Our attitudes need to be changed, how we perceive people of color as a threat. I'll tell another quick story. On my way when I was in my doctoral program, I went to Miami University and I was teaching classes. That's when I began to teach as a teaching assistant, as a part of my assistantship. And on my way coming back from there, dressed like I am today, I was pulled over by a police officer. And this is one of many stories. I like to just tell stories just because everybody doesn't have the same experience as maybe I do or people of color. And so I think it helps build empathy when you know what others are going through. And on my way back, I was pulled over and the police harassed me and searched my car for drugs. And I had my briefcase in the back. I had college textbooks. And it was a decent car, which doesn't matter, but he insisted that I was a drug dealer. I couldn't possibly have been coming from Miami University going back home. It is the perception of seeing people as a threat that often causes violence against African Americans. And so we've been talking about, there's the debate about police training and those kinds of things. And so I think that helps. And lastly, I want to show you some resources. This is from a website called Democracy in Me. And it is a project from Cincinnati Public Radio. And it's designed for teachers and the general public. It provides teaching resources and education for the general public in a couple of different areas. The area of civics, US history, diversity, inclusion, and in particular, African-American history. Click on that first one. And so if there's teachers in the audience, or not just teachers, all of us in the United States are homeschooling. So what I wanted to do is provide folks with takeaways. We're all virtual learning now, many of us. And so this is for you parents as well. This is called, Can I Really Make a Difference? How Average Citizens Can Participate in the Democratic Process. So if you can go down to the bottom. There's some questions there. I'm sorry, go back up just a little bit there, okay? You can see discussion questions there. Other people think of youth under the age of 18 as being too young to be involved in the civic process. And they ask questions about that. Okay, can you go back out, please? And we're gonna go to another article. Just hit back. Okay, that driving while black, I made a reference to that one there. You don't have to click on that. Go down to lesson plan. I'm sorry, the next one. Lesson plan on the history of creating racially. Yeah, click on that right there. Okay, so this is an example of resources. This is a lesson plan on the history of creating racially segregated communities in the US. And it just click on that teaching tolerance, that red, yeah, right there. These are some resources for you, teaching about racism and police violence. So you can use this in your home school setting or in your classrooms. Okay, hit back twice. Let's go back to that main site. I'll do a couple more and then I'll wrap up. Go down to teachers. Here are 4 approaches to creating a multicultural curriculum. This is the work of James Banks. And James, this whole short article is all about meaningful ways to integrate a multicultural curriculum into your lesson plan. Go down to the bottom, please, the bottom of that article. There are resources that you can use. Let's see, goals and dimensions, approach to multicultural reform. Okay, let's look at maybe 1 or 2 more. Go out, please. Thank you. I'll just refer to these. There's an article on the Black Wall Street massacre. There's a history of Juneteenth. I'll stop here on this. Walking While Black. Let's go to that one. These are all articles that we've written for the public, free resources. This talks about my own experience as a teenager when I was apprehended by the police going to work when I worked the subway. My mom was wondering where I was. Go to the bottom of the page, please. And again, there are a couple of resources. There's PBS teaching resources, confronting anti-bias, et cetera, and so forth. So in closing, last slide there, let's go back to our slide presentation, and then we'll go to questions. Oh, that's okay. I can talk through it as she goes. The last slide is my references. And I just wanted you to have a sense of what my references were. There's a couple of books that I'll just take 30 seconds, Mark, to name. There you go, Slave Patrols, Law, Violence. A lot of the work I got from that book, Slave Patrol, Law and Violence in Virginia. A synopsis of the African-American experiences from slavery to freedom. John Hope Franklin, one of the foremost historians in African-American history. Blacks and Gangs book, Slave Community. Du Bois, Souls of Black Folks, last slide. All right, are there any questions that others might have? He's going to share some questions or comments.
Well, Dr. Josh, first of all, the comments are grateful as the audience feels informed by this and appreciative of your presentation. Let me give you this question, if I could, from Keith Lancer. I recently heard the story of the Wilmington insurrection in 1898, which was a mass riot carried out by white supremacists in Wilmington, North Carolina, which led to the violent overthrow of duly elected local government officials. It was literally a coup. Are there other examples of radicalized terrorism in the U.S., and what might happen if we do nothing about addressing this form of violence? Could it happen again today?
Yes. I'm going to point to can you go back to the Democracy and Me website? I've got folks earning their keep today. I want to show you that article. I want to direct your attention to the article on Black Wall Street, the massacre of Black Wall Street. Yeah, just go back out and it should pop up there one more time. That's it right there. What happened at the massacre of Black Wall Street? That's probably one of the best examples, the worst examples. What happened was there was you can click on that, please. There was a prominent Black community in the early 20th century that were very wealthy, bankers, et cetera, and so forth. And the white community was not pleased with it. And so they basically terrorized it and burned the whole thing down. There are many other examples of that in the United States. So yes.
We have a question from Samuel Pinheiro, and he is from Brazil. And he says, I'm really impressed how the violence against Black people in the U.S. is very similar with Brazil. I would like to ask how the mechanics of historical negationism about Black violence is still operating and how to fight against it.
Yeah, and I love that question. By the way, thank you so much. I'm really humbled that somebody from Brazil was able to join us. It shows the great work of the Scripps Howard Foundation and the work that Mark is doing, the director and the museum here. So just amazing. Folks, racism is a global problem. The issue of white supremacy is a global problem. When I use white supremacy as a historian, I don't mean necessarily KKK, the Proud Boys. I mean the notion that whiteness and European culture is best and that other cultures are inferior. African American or African, South American people of color, the culture, the educational institutions are all inferior. That's what I mean by Eurocentrism or white supremacy. And that's a flawed mindset because we're all humans. Everybody in the human project benefits. There's some folks that are good at certain things and others are good at other things. It's the human experience. And so that mindset contributes to racism that people of color are inferior, and it's global. We just have our particular brand of it in the United States. It's a particularly insidious brand because of the legacy of slavery that we're still experiencing today, slavery, Jim Crow, et cetera, and so forth. So thank you for that question.
A question that came early in your presentation as you were telling the personal story about being stalked by police, and you told a second story about that as well. But the question, did you consider a lawsuit or calling the American Civil Liberties Union, or why is there a remedy for this in court? Have you considered that?
That's a good question. My answer would be it's happened so frequently. I only gave 2 or 3 examples, but it's been a pattern in my life. Perhaps I could, but it happens so frequently, I would be in court all the time. Just when I think, one of the examples I gave was from this year. Just when I think, and I remember during the pandemic, I said to myself, well, I don't have to worry about being stopped by the police unjustly because we're not outside. This was during quarantine when the country was shut down or the city was shut down where I was living, and we couldn't really go outside except just to go to the store. So I was basically in the house, my children and I was teaching, doing my university classes remotely. And I said to myself, well, at least I don't have to worry about police harassment. The day that I went back out to get groceries, I was pulled over and harassed by the police. So it's been a pattern. There probably is some due process that I can pursue, but I have not. And so how do you remedy it? Education and conversations, what we're doing now, that we're having now. And I want to reiterate, my friends are police officers. I just recently had an officer in one of my classes. We talk about these same things, both Black and white, and they agree with me. And so there are folks out there that would think this is an anti-police conversation. To me, that's short-sighted. You know, I would go after you and say that's short-sighted. You're not willing to push and look at things on a deeper level. So
there is a question that kind of relates to what you just said. That one of our viewers wonders, so much of this violence seems intentional. What are your thoughts on, is there a shadow policing culture that exists in America that's responsible for this, or just that's the question?
Great question. That's a both and answer. Yes, there is I remember there is a network, and it's coming out. There are a network of officers that are white supremacists that are part of these secret societies. I remember my uncle, he said he worked for the city all of his life out in Butler County, and he was a part of a union, and some of the gentlemen were, some of the guys he knew were police officers. He said he was buddies with them his whole life. and they had been to one another's house, and one of the gentlemen died, and he went to the funeral. This is a white guy. My uncle's black, of course, but the white guy he was friends with, a group of white guys, they had the funeral, and in his casket, they laid a Klansman hood. He had been a part of the Klan his whole life. So a lot of these folks, yes, and you don't have to dig that deep. A lot of these officers are, and it's coming out, a part of the Klan. And some elected officials are connected to white supremacy. But by and large, well, the reason I said both and, a lot of folks are well-meaning. Police officers, it's a stressful job. And society is constantly putting images in our minds that people like me are a threat. Especially when I have my baseball cap on and my mask. There's always these images that we are a threat. And so if a person like me is pulled over and I'm angry and I'm arguing with the police, their first, not all of them, but many people, their first reaction is, my life is threatened. I need to make sure I know where my gun is. And that's a lot of times it's reactionary. So I would say some killings are sort of, and you hear it, we need to get rid of these black folks because they're the problem, these gangbangers. But by and large, it's just fear and the lack of training as well.
Susan Geister shared with us a link to some breaking news. So we really, I can't show that, I don't think, but she says the news broke on the National Evening News that there's new footage being released about Ahmaud Arbery, and please add Casey Goodson to the long list of innocents shot by police. I think the essence of the question is this isn't over.
Right, it's not over.
And a colleague of yours, Chris Yohe, who you recognize her name, Professor Yohe, says, please help us understand the unimaginable for a white person like me task of preparing your children for how to navigate a white supremacist world. How do you balance keeping them safe while helping them also have hope?
Yes, in my tradition, there has to be hope. I come from a long tradition of socially justice-minded African-American Christians where we talk about hope. We have to. And with my students, and my students that are listening, I know a lot of the material that I present is disconcerting, is disheartening, but we can't have a Pollyannish colorblind view in order to all be friends. We have to, as historians, we have to dig deep and look at the truth of the matter. But at the same time, say we're all brothers and sisters. We are a part of this struggle called humanity. We are all a part of this human experience. We're all going through this pandemic together. We're all going through this election fight together. And we have more in common than different. But at the same time, we are not the melting pot. We are the salad bowl. The melting pot metaphor is outdated. We're not all just melted together, our different cultures as Americans, but we can be the salad bowl or the stew where we can celebrate our differences, but at the same time call ourselves American. So there's that both and. We have to go after injustice, but at the same time, the hope says we're getting better. There's a lot of these things we talked about that doesn't happen anymore. So we are making progress. I have faith in our democracy. Regardless of who you voted for, the democracy won out. There were forces that tried to undermine it, but democracy came, and we're encouraged today. So,
Dr. Childs, thank you. And I would also like to thank Jason Houston, Brendan Connolly, and Madison Engel, the Norse media team, for doing a wonderful job on the technology tonight. You can't see them, but we can, and we know what a great job they're doing. And we're a small group here, but I think we join with the audience to say thank you.
Thank you so much. Till we meet again, till we meet again. God be with you till we meet again. God be with you. God be with you American tradition. Thank y'all for listening and joining in. God bless.